Hello, Miguel Trujillo again. And also, I wanted to mention again that this is a video where I have no script. In fact, I barely even have an idea about what I want this video to be about. So, there was one thing I wanted to address, and it's something I talk about every once in a while. And it's called the virtue of skepticism. I think of skepticism as an intellectual virtue, an intellectual moral virtue. And let me tell you what triggered me to think about this. I was reading a book called The Dream of Reason by, let's see, who was it by? Mr. Gottlieb, Anthony Gottlieb. And in this book, he talks about the Pythagoreans and how the Pythagoreans came up with this idea called the music of the spheres. So the idea, now if you recall, Pythagoreanism is all about mathematics and the virtue of thinking about math and how math is essential to the world and how math can be found in everything, including music, which was one of the major contributions of the Pythagoreans. They identified the fact that things that vibrate and make sounds according to their length. You know, there was an association between the pitch of sound and the, say, the length of string that was plucked on a guitar or stringed instrument. And so the Pythagoreans postulated something called music of the spheres. They knew about astronomy and the planets, and their idea was that the revolution of the planets in their orbits sort of creates a sound. It creates a sort of music, and the pitch of that of the tones of that music is proportional to the I guess the size of the orbits of the planets. So this is a very this was considered at the time very beautiful, and indeed this idea was transmitted from generation to generation through Dante and Shakespeare, and even today we have it. I'm not sure if anybody really believes in the music of the spheres itself, but we certainly know about it today. And at least the idea was known and passed on. But this is where the idea of skepticism as a virtue comes in. You know, I think that there were people who believed that the music of the spheres was real, and but of course there was one big problem, and that is we don't hear music all the time. You know, if something as large as a planet was making these sounds, creating this music, as these planets orbit the Earth at the time with the geocentric model, you would think we'd be hearing thunderous music constantly during the daytime, during the nighttime, but no one heard any music. And in fact, I can just imagine a situation where one of the followers of Pythagoras would say, I love this music of the spheres idea. It's such a beautiful idea, and because it's so beautiful, it must be true. But there's a problem. There's no evidence that there's actually music being transmitted by these planets. Now, of course, you and I know that the planets orbit in space, which is a vacuum, and that vacuum is incapable of transmitting sound. So today we know the idea is completely ludicrous, and if it has any validity at all, it has a metaphorical validity. You know, you could just as well think of the music of the planets as you could think of the music of electrons orbiting nuclei. So I can just imagine, like I said, that conversation between the pupil of Pythagoras and Pythagoras. And, I mean, what would Pythagoras say in response? How would he rebut that question? He might say something like, well, the sound is too muffled, or is not loud enough for us to hear it at all. In fact, we only hear silence. That's probably, he probably said a variation on that theme. He also might have said something like, well, only virtuous souls can hear the music of the spheres. Or he might say, well, he might give a lot of arguments. He might have lots of arguments for why we can't hear the music of the spheres. I mean, there's a million different arguments about why. Maybe he's hard of hearing. I can imagine, though, a lot of people thinking to themselves, I don't hear this music of the spheres. Is something wrong with me? Maybe I have a deficit of some kind, a mental deficit, a hearing deficit. Why aren't I hearing the music of the spheres? And I think it's at that point that the virtue of skepticism could have basically prevented this group of people from sort of rolling off the rails. There's a point where there's a decision point where you break from reality. When you fail to consider evidence, or you fail to evidence is what keeps us on the rails, in our thinking. And if you dismiss evidence, then very quickly, I think you become detached from reality. And that happened in my last video. I talked a little bit about the Hale-Bopp comet, and what was that cult? There was a cult, there was. I was just talking about the cult leader, and how the cult leader must have talked to his pupils and said, "Hey, there are aliens that are traveling on these comets." And if we kill ourselves at the moment that the Hale-Bopp comet is closest, then, we'll be transfigured and we'll be moved from Earth to the spaceship. It's at that time where the pupil, if he was exercising his intellectual virtue of skepticism, would say, "Well, where's the evidence?" And it was a critical. There was a critical decision point for each one of those followers of that cult, and they didn't have that intellectual virtue. What's the opposite of a virtue? A vice. They had the vice of basically believing arguments from authority. So, or you could also call that vice faith. Basically it was an argument from authority, and they got suckered into it because they didn't request evidence to substantiate the belief, and they went and believed it anyway. And there are a lot, and so I'm drawing an interesting parallel here. The parallel is that the intellectual virtue of skepticism is able to protect you. It protects, when it comes to the members of that cult, with the help that killed themselves with the Hale-Bopp comet, the virtue of skepticism, unfortunately, did not save the lives of the people in those cults. And unfortunately, also, and when it came to Pythagoras, and his music of the spheres, unfortunately, those people, who might have believed those ideas about the music of the spheres, well, they didn't practice that intellectual virtue of skepticism either. They didn't demand evidence, or maybe their demands for evidence were weak. And they didn't make the decision to dismiss the theory or dismiss the hypothesis that there was music coming from the orbiting planets. And there might have been one or two people that spent years believing that was true. Even though now, of course, we know it is certainly not true. The virtue of skepticism can help a lot of people. Now, there is a way to sort of... the virtue of skepticism can be perverted. The virtue of skepticism is perverted when it's used to such a high degree that you end up being a nihilist. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with nihilism. I think nihilism is a perfectly valid philosophy, and it's perfectly applicable to many aspects of life. But not believing that, say, any knowledge is possible under any circumstance doesn't get you very far. If you're hungry, you might not eat your lunch because you're skeptical that the hunger pangs have anything to do with food. Or if you're so skeptical that when you're thirsty you don't drink water, that's a problem. And that's how the virtue of skepticism can be perverted, and it can turn into a vice. So there's definitely a golden mean here, where you need there's a certain range of skepticism that a healthy person ought to have to sort of conduct their lives with as much well-being as possible. You don't want to believe every story without evidence that people throw at you. But then again, you don't want to be so skeptical that you're fine with sitting in a chair all day, every day, for the rest of your life, which might be short. So, anyway, that's my little spiel on the virtue of skepticism. And, interestingly enough, I think that if a person raised the range of skepticism, that is, their skepticism, say, was probably at a fairly low level, but then raised it, I think, if you start out at a fairly low level of skepticism, if you raise it slightly, I think that really you can only benefit from that change. Because if something is real, then with a little research, you'll find it out. You'll find the evidence that supports that idea, and you'll rightly trust that idea. Whereas if your range of skepticism is low, you're only marginally skeptical of things, but end up believing them anyway. You tend to be somewhat gullible. Then you can get yourself into trouble. There are marketing techniques on the internet and on television and at car dealerships that can get you in trouble. If you pay attention to a lot of the cultural messages and social messages that are available and sort of buy into those, like, Disney stereotypes about the way women ought to be, if you're that gullible, then you're going to run into trouble when, say, you get married and then subsequently get divorced. You're going to be a little bit upset. So by raising the range of skepticism to making it more powerful, that you question more before you start believing anything, I think you can really only benefit. And surely that was a point where that skepticism increases to such an amount that basically, well, what happens, I think, is you become inflexible and set in your ways, and that's not great. So there, you got to tune it. You got to tune it, and it's probably contextually relevant. So when it comes to things like I don't know. I'm sure there are certain areas where you need to be more skeptical than other areas. When you're surfing the internet, you should be very, very skeptical. Only proceed with evidence-based arguments. When you're having conversations with other people, also, be skeptical. But if you start getting hungry, I suggest you eat before you're hungry for too long. Yeah. So anyway, it was nice talking to you. And take it easy. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.